Hello, and welcome to the second episode of our Hidden Gems podcast here at the Weiser Science Museum. As always, I am your host, Dr. Joseph Fredrickson, director of the Weiser Science Museum, and today we're joined by a very special guest, master's student Brian Conway here at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh Biology Department. Welcome.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me, Joe.
Yeah, so the Weiser Science Museum has been very busy this week. We actually had multiple events happening, including Dinosaur Days and Wild Rose, where we went and brought a bunch of real fossils as well as replicas to a community center and library and showed off to about 100 small children and their families all the wonders of what it is to be a dinosaur paleontologist. And this is, I think, a good segue to talk to you, Brian, a little bit about what you do and your research. So you've had a very busy summer this year. What have you been up to?
So upon finishing the semester this year, I went out to Utah for a conference, and then I helped my advisor, Joe Peterson, dig at the Cleveland Lloyd Quarry, and we found a lot of interesting stuff there this year, like some new, possibly baby allosaur material, in addition to I found this really nice camptosaur claw from the hand, the manus as we call it. And then on the way back, I made a couple stops at museums for my master's research, which is basically how we can use signs of injury or disease to interpret behavior in extinct animals. And the ones that I'm focusing on are the horned dinosaurs, which we call ceratopsids. And it's been sort of speculated for a while that they use their really wild, crazy-looking horns and bosses on the skull for interactions like what you'd see in bison or bighorn sheep or rhinos today, wherein they fight for dominance or territory or the right to mate. And one way we can interpret that is if they have injuries concentrated on specific areas of their body or how frequently they get them in general. And this might tell us a bit about discrete events in their life, which if we have large enough samples of these animals to see, they're probably engaging in this behavior, we think.
Very cool. So the ceratopsians, let's talk a little bit more about them as animals. These are some of my favorite dinosaurs. As you know, this is what I actually studied for my master's thesis, was a dinosaur called Centrosaurus. Centrosaurus doesn't quite get as much airplay in movies and pop culture as the more famous Triceratops, probably the most famous ceratopsid. But these animals all have some very interesting characteristics that they evolved, and maybe you could tell a little bit more about what sets them apart from the other dinosaurs.
Yeah, so the most extravagant thing that sets them apart from other dinosaurs is their frill, the large hood-like crests coming out, which is actually formed from their skull, which is partly the parietal, which is in humans like the back of the skull right here, but in them it forms this really, really large, flat sort of shelf, which would have been covered in skin and other soft tissue in life. And it's also ringed by these osteoderms, like these bones which fuse onto it as the animal grows and ages in most of these animals. But also they have these really enlarged, spectacular horns formed from the nose, the nasal, and in addition to just above the eye socket.
So they have these horns all over their face, and then they have this big shield-like structure on the back of their head. It's probably no wonder why scientists, when they first found these things, thought they were using them for weapons.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
I mean, these things look like spears, they look like shields, they look like things that would be just perfect for battling. Is that what scientists still think they did with those?
Maybe sometimes, but by and large, now we think it has something to do with what we call sexual selection, which is when structures like these, which don't have any sort of, which have an ambiguous function, we'll say, they are likely used for members of the same species to recognize each other and to show off to members of the same species using repeated displays, like what you'd see a peacock do, or what you'd see maybe elephant seals do. They got these crazy big inflatable noses, and it's they bellow to attract females to them. So we think that these arrays of horns and crests in ceratopsid dinosaurs were primarily used to establish dominance between members of the same species and compete for mates, we think.
Now, one thing with the two examples you gave with elephant seals and peacocks is that they are sexually dimorphic.
Yes.
So sexual dimorphism is basically a difference between the males and females, and it can be as simple as size differences. So we see that in a lot of animals like reptiles, like snakes, where the females tend to be larger than the males, or it can be extravagant features like we just talked about with the peacocks with their colors, where the peahen tends to be more dull because they're not needing to do any of the attraction that the males have to do to compete for that mate. Do we see any evidence of sexual dimorphism in ceratopsians?
The evidence at best is ambiguous, unfortunately. A paleontologist named Peter Dodson did a pretty classic study on Protoceratops in the 1970s, wherein he clustered skulls into two different morphs, like thinking one was male and the other is female. But it's kind of hard to untangle those changes from just changes in the relative proportions of the animal as they grew, or in like the status of their maturity, which we can tell by like a variety of features, like the fusion of bones in the skull, or like the actual internal structure of the bone, which is the best way to tell like the age of an animal. But there's no consensus on whether or not they're dimorphic, at least in terms of like their frills or horns. But we think there could possibly have been size dimorphism in ceratopsids. We think, in an absolute sense, like what we see in alligators and crocodiles today.
Yeah. Okay, so there are two major groups of ceratopsids that occur only in the late Cretaceous. So the dinosaurs lived during the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods of the Mesozoic era, and we only see these ceratopsids at the very end. So they were living in, the twilight of the dinosaurs. What is the difference between these two groups, and what are they called?
These two groups are called centrosaurians, and they're characterized by a relatively shorter frill with a fatter lower margin of the frill called the squamosal, being like this sort of wedge-shaped element, and the frill is generally just kind of shorter relative to the length of the skull. And they also have generally a really large nasal horn and smaller brow horns, or like this really inflated, gnarly-looking boss on the nose as well. And then the other group are called chasmosaurians, and that includes Triceratops, which these guys are characterized by like a relatively longer frill that extends way out the back of the skull, or from the skull, and a relatively smaller nasal horn, nose horn, and larger, more elaborate brow horns.
Okay, so that brings me to our special collection specimen that we bring out for every single podcast. And this one is sort of a little bit of a mystery, and I thought maybe you could help tell us a little bit more about it. We found this in what was called the Sharilla collection. The Sharilla collection was a bunch of fossils that were donated to us over a decade ago, and some of them were really well labeled, and some of them not so much. And this one came in, and it didn't have much information about it. But I knew by looking at its shape, kind of right off the bat, what it was, if I couldn't tell exactly which species it belonged to. And I think it ties in well to what we were just talking about with this centrosaurian chasmosaurian difference. Now, for those of you listening who can't see this fossil, it is a hand-sized specimen, so it fits nicely in the palm of my hands. It's triangular in shape, so it looks a little bit like a horn, and it has this nice long-grained bone texture coming off of it. So it is a bone with the grains that are all going kind of in the same direction towards the apex of the top of what we would call a horn. So I'm going to hand this to you. Take a look at it for a second, and why don't you tell me a little bit more about what we're looking at?
Well, Joe, I think this is a cheek spike from a chasmosaurian, one of the longer brow-horned horned dinosaurs.
So you're telling me that they didn't just have spikes on their nose and over their eyes, they also had them on their cheeks?
That's right.
Okay, so these were obviously much smaller spikes.
Yes, what they do is that they tend to grow as like in the actual skin of the animal, and then like as the animal ages, it may or may not like fuse onto the cheekbone, which we call the jugal, as the animal reaches maturity, skeletal maturity, we'll say.
So you're saying it will eventually ossify onto the rest of the skull and become, basically part of the rest of the skull. Does that tell us anything about how old this individual might have been, that maybe it's not fully fused?
It can, yes.
Is there anything that can tell us after it fuses how old they are?
For these sorts of ossifications, we can see if it's how heavily resorbed, it's like flattens into the cheek, or if the bone texture changes from grain to what we call mottled, which is like almost this sort of like basket weave texture that we see on the bone. Like when you put it up to your face and look at it real close, you can see it's not long. You can see in a mature animal, it wouldn't necessarily be long grained anymore, but it would have this a lot more like porous and woven sort of texture on the surface as well.
So you're saying that in the really old animals, it'll sometimes actually resorb that bone and basically take it away.
Yes.
What would be the purpose of doing this? Why would you want less bone, or why would you need to take bone away from your own skeleton? It seems like it's there for a reason.
Yeah, that is. Like, we think the main reason for these marginal osteoderms, like on the skull, is like to show off to members of a different sex for the purpose of reproduction. And something that's been bothering me for a while is actually, even if the bone is going away, we don't necessarily know what the skin over it is doing. Because like in modern ungulates, like bison and cattle, they can actually do something that similar to the bone, to the actual, to these ossifications, in that the actual bony core can start to go away a little bit, but then the actual covering, the actual sheath keeps growing, irrespective of that.
And I imagine that they were covered in a keratinous-like substance, probably something similar to the fingernails.
Yeah, keratin, exactly what fingernails are made of, and what also makes up like the external coverings of horns and bovids, but also things like claws, bird beaks, things like that.
So these things would be extremely sharp in life if they were full-on horns.
Yeah, they would have been, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive. So these are pretty amazing animals. So is there anything else you want to tell us about your research? As any of the findings, anything that kind of jumps out at you? I know you're still publishing your master's thesis, so you don't have to give anything away. But is there anything that you saw that was really, really cool that maybe the general public doesn't know a whole lot about? I'm sure to some people, the idea of injuries in dinosaurs is something that never occurred to them. So is there like a common injury that you see? Are injuries actually like, are they in most specimens? Are they very, very rare? I'd like to know more about that.
Injuries in general are actually pretty rare in the dinosaurs that I've studied. I've looked at Centrosaurus and Pachyrhinosaurus, but I've also looked at Triceratops and some other Chasmosaurian specimens additionally. But injuries in general are rare, but they most commonly tend to happen on the ribs, just like fractured ribs. And this is something we see not just on horned dinosaurs, but lots of animals in general in the fossil record. Ribs are the bones that are most likely to break in a lot of cases because they're generally long and thin, and they have a lot of them in a series. So like if the animal's exposed to any sort of sudden physical stress or impact, they're just likely to break if they're impacted in the thorax of their body.
I mean, you only have like two, femurs to break, but you have lots of ribs.
Yeah, and femora are really hard to break, and if the femur breaks, that's likely
bad. That's bad news.
That's going to be
it's
fatal.
probably not going to survive that. But a rib break, these things probably could bounce back.
But one really interesting specimen, it's not a rib, but it's actually a set of neck vertebrae, what we call cervical vertebrae, and it's actually, they've been crushed into each other and fused and rehealed. So the animal's neck, this Pachyrhinosaur, I think its neck actually broke, but it managed to live through that end.
And that's a pretty traumatic injury for one of these things, because with all of that armor on the front of their face, with all those, horns and that shield, those heads have to be very, very heavy.
They are, yes.
So to have a broken neck and to carry that around and survive it long enough to heal that wound meant that these were pretty tough creatures.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. We also think that their neck and shoulder musculature would have had to have been like massive for actually moving the head around as well.
So what is the plan for you going forward? How much you have left to go on your thesis, and when do you think you'll be all finished?
I plan to be finished by this December with my thesis, and then I'm going to try and get it published and start working on a couple other things as well.
Fantastic. So we'll keep an eye out for all of that. All right. So what we like to do when we have a guest on is for this podcast, we usually like to have a little game that we play, or in this case, a power ranking. And what I want to do is I want to ask you for, since we had this whole conversation about dinosaurs, and that's your expertise, is I want you to power rank your top 5 dinosaur movies. Okay? So not documentaries, not TV shows, movies. So starting with number 5, and let's work our way to number 1, and this is your opinion. So you can justify it any way that you want, even if I disagree with you. All right, so let's start with number 5.
Okay, I feel guilty saying this, but I love Jurassic Park 3. It's just a fun adventure movie, and I had to put it on my list.
Yeah, I guess you should feel bad about that. No, I'm just kidding. It's like I said, it's your choice.
It's a fun dinosaur adventure
Jurassic
movie,
Park 3. So what about Jurassic Park 3 that you really like that made it above Jurassic Park 2 or Jurassic World? What about it that captured your imagination?
It's just a very streamlined movie, and it's like, I know the outcome of this fight is just the source of so much controversy for no good reason, but I really just like the Tyrannosaurus versus Spinosaurus fight.
Tyrannosaurus versus terrestrial Spinosaurus,
Yeah.
circa mid-2000s.
Yeah, early 2000s Spinosaurus. I mean, Spinosaurus is like, who even knows what Spinosaurus actually looked like?
It's wild. One of the only aquatic non-avian dinosaurs.
Yeah.
And it's got some really odd adaptations.
Yeah.
But it had the size of, at least by length, of a T-Rex.
Yeah.
Now, as we know, they would have never met each other because they lived tens of millions of years apart and on different continents.
That's right.
But this is a movie world, so we can do whatever we want.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, number 4.
So my number 4 pick is Valley of the Gwangi from the late 1960s. I mean, I just think that's kind of it's a really interesting dinosaur movie where they find this Allosaurus in this canyon and they try and put it into a circus. And I also find older stop motion animation is really kind of charming.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that sort of stiltedness. You can tell that they're doing their best to replicate real motion, but they haven't quite. They don't quite get it right. I just sort of like that obvious sort of artifice of manufacturing a movie monster for enjoyment, I think.
And there's a real artistic talent that had to go into
absolutely.
that. And I think the one thing about Gwangi is it's obviously Harryhausen who did it, which is so important for dinosaur movies, for how we do things today even.
Mm-hmm.
And the things that they were doing were all cutting edge at the time, even with claymation, with just clay models. They were doing things that nobody had done before because nobody knew how to make those into, how to make a dinosaur without making a giant puppet. This is the next mistake. Or film a crocodile with some spikes on its back, fighting, some kind of lizard, which is a little bit sad. So I think my favorite scene in Gwangi is the Allosaurus attacking the elephant, which is just a wild scene. Okay, number 3.
Number 3 is The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which is sort of like one of the founders of the giant radioactive, or not necessarily radioactive, but giant reptilian monster attacks the city genre, I think. It actually precedes Godzilla by a couple years, I think, and it's again, it's Harryhausen at the top of his craft, having this giant, I don't know, this sort of stem archosauromorph ravaging a city. It's pretty cool.
We can have lots of debates on whether Godzilla is a dinosaur or not, and we're going to leave that for the message boards, not for right here.
Yeah.
This is movie, this is fiction, so we'll consider them all dinosaurs in this realm. All right, number 2.
Number 2 is actually for nostalgic reasons purely, the movie called Dinosaur from 2000 with the talking iguanodon and the absurdly oversized Carnotaurus.
So this is a Walt Disney movie that follows an iguanodon when an asteroid hit. And we're assuming it's supposed to be the KT extinction, but all the dinosaurs survive at the end. So maybe it's a different asteroid impact event.
Iguanodon and the KT boundary.
Yeah, they're a little bit out of place, right? By some millions of years.
With
Same
this
thing.
family of lemurs.
Yeah, Yeah, okay, so we're not going to take it as a science movie, but the visuals are fantastic. I think that opening scene following the egg through the different ecosystems is beautiful. And I love it because going back to Ceratopsians, it's the first movie that shows off Pachyrhinosaurus.
Yeah.
And Pachyrhinosaurus has now become fairly famous because of the Walking with Dinosaurs movie and a few other examples where it's been included in some of the documentaries. So I think it's become a fairly well-known dinosaur, but at the time, it was pretty obscure.
Yeah.
And I absolutely love that they brought that into the movie,
Yeah.
even as a side character.
Yeah, who gets killed by the Carnotaurus immediately.
Hey, Carnotaurus gotta eat, right?
Yeah, that's true.
All right, number one.
I mean, the obvious basic pick for me for number one is Jurassic Park, of course. I mean, just the best dinosaur movie that we have currently.
And that's, I mean, let's just be honest.
Yeah.
That is absolutely true. There is no debate here. It is the best dinosaur movie ever.
Yeah.
But seriously, Jurassic Park, it was hugely influential to not just movie culture, not just dinosaur toys and dinosaurs in pop culture, but also for our science. I think a lot of people who are now becoming paleontologists, myself included, you as well, were influenced by that movie when it came out, and that really guided us as scientists in our trajectory of that this was something people really did, and that there's meaningful research to be done, maybe not bringing dinosaurs back, but to understand how these things lived and what they were. So I believe we call it the Jurassic generation. And we are a new group of people. So, I mean, I can't think of anyone in that I know that in the paleontology circles that can't at least point to Jurassic Park as being somewhat of an influence on them.
Right, yeah. I'm a bit, like, after the Jurassic Park generation, I think.
You're the Jurassic Park 3 generation.
I guess so, yeah.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much, Brian, for joining us today on the Hidden Gems podcast. It was fantastic to hear about your research, and I look forward to seeing what you publish about dinosaur injuries and seeing some of your new projects coming up on Ceratopsians. Thank you for joining us today, whether you're listening to this on your streaming service or you're watching it on YouTube. Next week, we'll be coming out with a new episode with our curator, Dr. Don Mikulik, and we're going to be discussing a really weird creature, the Tully monster, and how he contributed to that creature becoming the state fossil of Illinois. All right, if you have any questions and you want us to answer those or talk about them on the podcast, you can reach us at trevorwesm@gmail.com. He is our producer, and we'll be happy to forward those along to us at the show. As always, you can listen to or watch this podcast on our many platforms, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, and Amazon Music. All right, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.